Tim, at that time, was working with flag officers who come in various forms. And the worst of the imperial ones. And he happened to be working for an imperialist. And I tell you, that's so much for me to be able to talk to somebody from the Navy with their head on straight and down there and get things done. So Tim has always been my hero. He was later replaced by Stan Arthur. I think both of us agree Stan Arthur ought to be king of the world because he's as good as that gets. It's an honor for me to be with you. My involvement in North Florida has been since we retired here in '94, except my wife lives here and I use the airport to go to and from work all the time. So, I'm not as much a part of it as I would like to be, although I am with the University of West Florida under the leadership of Collier Merrill. And we are doing our best to bring excellence to that institution. It certainly has the right start with the Institute and with the School of Business that they have there. So I'm very, very proud of the University of West Florida, and I'm just deeply honored to be able to be with the people of that institution. And I'm also proud. Now, the other reason, of course, that Herbert and Pesco won all the awards is the way that Northwest Florida voted for George Bush. Maybe a Democrat. Believe me, good hands if you're a Republican in the White House and you live in Northwest Florida. Some time ago, I wrote a paper about machines and human beings and how they interact in warfare, and I did that for Argentina. And I sent Tim a copy of it. This was last fall, and he said, well, maybe come over and talk to him. I thought I was going to be talking to the Institute. And so, and I'll tell you where I got onto this. I was in the Pentagon looking at some film on AC-130 gunship flying combat in Afghanistan. And what is infrared sight, so it sees at night, it sees these buildings and cars and things like that, and we're looking for these Al-Qaeda guys. And so I'm listening to the voice tape. It's like looking at a videotape. You're looking through this system, and you hear the guy, the fire patrol guy aboard the airplane, in combat, getting ready to shoot, and he's talking to a woman. And this woman is located in California. And she can say, no, it's not the square building, that's the mosque. You want the building next to it. And then the next thing I hear them talking about is another voice chimes in, and it's a linguist from Georgia, USA, Fort Worth. And he's saying, it's the second guy out the door is the one you're going to pop. Now that's where war has come to. So this idea of human-machine interaction is fundamental to many things, but certainly it is to war. Also, in Las Vegas 2 years ago, we took a look at a thing called time-sensitive targeting. You're going to hear that term more and more. That strike on Saddam Hussein last night was time-sensitive targeting. And in this case, what we had is we had an airplane flying over the Nellis Ranges, and we had actual Scud missiles driving around on the range. And this airplane on the Nellis Ranges used its radar to find those missiles. And then it passed that information to a satellite, who then passed it to an Apache helicopter, and that satellite information fed directly into the Apache helicopter's fire control system. So when the Apache came up over the mountain, his gun sight was sitting right on the target. And so those are the kinds of things that are happening in warfare. And those are the kinds of things that obviously that Ken and the Institute are working on so much. Now, where did it come from? All this integration of technology, and what does it mean in warfare? And we're seeing it in the war that's going on in Iraq today. But it also has a lot of traps that we got to think through. For example, in Serbia, the war in Kosovo, the Serbs did not turn on their surface-to-air missile guidance radars because they watched us in Desert Storm when anytime the radar came up, we'd smack it. And pretty soon, the radar operators on the ground got so they were afraid to turn on their radars. So this is the first step called effects-based operations, where you affect somebody. You don't necessarily kill them, you get them to change their behavior. And as a result, in the Gulf War, we had literally thousands and thousands of radar missiles fired at our airplanes. But they didn't impact our airplanes because they didn't have any guidance radar to go with them, so they were just blind shots into the night. And as a result, we were able to fly medium altitude and avoid that particular threat. But then, in the future, in the case of Kosovo, where the Serbs didn't turn on the radars, except at the last minute, now the game becomes another game, a cat and mouse game. And so what we have to do is we have to become very, very fast in how we react. And in this case, we looked at where we have this electronic spy airplane in the air, and the minute he sees a high priority radar comes up on the battlefield, the operator sitting in the back of the airplane doesn't do anything. The machine itself sends that directly to a Joint Stars airplane, which has a radar that finds radars on the ground, the actual physical radar with its high quality radar. And that immediately sends the coordinates of that target to an F-16, which immediately goes right into the bomb. So you're flying your F-16, and suddenly you get a priority light that says turn here, you follow the steering, and you hit the button, the bomb comes off and hits the radar. And you can do that within seconds. So that's the kinds of things we're doing in modern warfare. Well, what do all these changes mean? How do they manifest themselves? What are we seeing? And quite frankly, you're seeing a lot of confusion, particularly on television. Because you see, people are judging warfare based on attrition warfare. They're judging it. In World War II, we knew how we were doing because we knew how many islands we were taking from the Japanese. We knew how many miles across France we were going. We knew how many ships we'd sunk, how many German tanks we'd blown up, how many fighters we'd lost and they'd lost. We could measure the progress in the warfare based on tangible things like how many bombs we dropped on the enemy, how many of his military forces destroyed the continent. You cannot do that anymore. And what we saw in Desert Storm, we saw, remember, 5 weeks of bombing and nothing happened, 5 weeks of bombing, nothing happened, 4 days of war, the ground war. Everybody said, what happened? How'd that go so fast? Then we saw the same thing in Kosovo. They were going day after day after day after day, nothing happened, nothing happened, nothing happened. On day 78, Milosevic says, I'm out of here. I can't handle this anymore. And now we're seeing it in Iraq. Where, remember, just last week, everybody was saying, oh, it's terrible, it's terrible. And suddenly, the 3rd Division's in Saddam Hussein's backyard chasing him around. So, what does all that mean? Well, it's the buzzwords that we use are shock and awe and rapid dominance. Now, those are nothing but shock. Those are nothing but just buzzwords to help people buy into the concept. But the idea is to produce an effect on the enemy and not necessarily kill everybody. Because war is ugly enough without going around slaughtering people. And remember, President Bush in 90 sent us into the Middle East War, and he gave us an admonition to keep the loss of life down. At first I thought he meant U.S. life, and then I thought he meant coalition life, but then I realized he meant on both sides, Iraqi and American. And I tell you, for those of us who were in Vietnam, when we measured our progress by how many enemy we killed, that was a great leap, because I always found that just obscene. The idea that you are successful to just kill everybody. Also, we've had Rumsfeld trying to transform the Pentagon. And he's had some luck. This goes back way back to a guy named Andy Marshall, who looks like he's 150 years old. He's only 140. And we've got some problems, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to change the military. And if you've been in the military, you know that's probably the most impossible thing that there is. I think it'd be harder to change the University of West Florida. And because the services see themselves in a certain way, and it affects what kind of equipment they buy, how they train, and how they organize themselves to go fight wars. Of course, the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps don't fight wars anymore. People that fight wars are people from the Army, Navy, and Marine Corps, and Air Force, but in fact, they're organized by land, sea, air, and space. They're functionally organized. And so the guy who could have my job as running the air war could be Tim Wright, for example. He's an airman, fully qualified, and we've done a marvelous job. And normally what we do is we give it to the service that has the preponderance of forces. In the case of the land component commander today in Iraq, it's an Army general, because the Army has 3 divisions, the Marines have a division. The Air Force has not really done as good a job as I wanted to. The Navy's been the best at transforming. The Navy did it, and I couldn't believe it, because to me the Navy has always been the one to stonewall the most. But the Navy is decided their job is to transport our forces to the area of conflict, and that means they have to have transport ships. It also means they have to have minesweepers, anti-submarine, and air defense to protect them en route, and all those kinds of things. Provide gunfire where appropriate, usually that's the cruise missiles. Can provide contribute to the air operations. So the Navy is pretty good at this. The Air Force has been hung up on their effort. They tend to be program oriented, so the Air Force sometimes loses sight of why it's there, and it's too much of it. They make great business, but and of course, the Marine Corps just keeps straight ahead, knows what the Marine Corps does, and don't worry about it. But it's really the Army that's had the problem, and the Army is the one where you're hearing a lot of the criticism now. And the reason is because historically they measure themselves in terms of size, not combat capability, and because they're having to become something they don't want to become. Right now, the way you defeat an enemy force is with air power. You don't want to close and slug it out on the battlefield. You have to have forces that can close and slug it out on the battlefield, but you want them slugging it out against an enemy that's already gone 10 rounds with the Air Force. It is weakened to the point where our people are able to survive the combat in much larger numbers. The other thing is, where the Army is really important, and the most important role they're going to play in this situation is going to be after the war is over. Because Iraq is going to be a very unstable environment, and we're going to need military force to provide law, order, and stability. We're going to need military force to provide the initial humanitarian efforts, medical support, and get the utilities back up running. And that's what the Army does. And it's a dirty, rotten job, and I don't envy them, but they're the ones that can do it, and they're the ones that can do it. But it also means that all that stuff they put in their reserve forces, civil affairs, military police, what they call ash and trash, really needs to be an active force, because that's where the Army really pays off. So we see this struggle going on, and it's really bad. We also got to know the role of technology. We have to have new ways of thinking, and I have trouble. I've reached that age now where the brain stopped. And I see these young kids and I say, what you got to do is figure out how to do things. We have a B-2, go anywhere unopposed. It can drop 8,500-pound guided bombs. You can destroy 80 simultaneously aimed ones. When Pete Van Ness and I were in Vietnam, it took us 80 airplanes to drop one bomb. Who knows how to do that? How do you use that capability? And it's going to take people that are really smart and really thinking about this, because the intellectual side of military operations is where we have the biggest need right now, because of all the new tools we have to fight wars. And I tell them, because they are smart. But the other thing is, also the operations of, for example, in Iraq, have grown well beyond the Pentagon. Jay Garner, who's on the space mission, Rumsfeld, has been appointed to head up a team, and everybody says, well, it's to go in there and run the country. No, that's not what he's appointed to do. What he's appointed to do is bring in State Department, FBI, CIA, Commerce, all the government agencies in Washington, and force them into a room and make them work together. And believe me, that is something no one in Washington likes to do, is work with other agencies. And they get in there and they fight and they maneuver, and it makes you think you're with the Joint Chiefs of Staff sometimes. That's Jay's job, and he'll do it. He's a very straightforward guy, he's a very low-key guy, and he's very capable. But that's what we're going to have to do, because the military is just a tiny part of the equation with regard to these crises, these things like Afghanistan, like Kosovo, like Bosnia and Macedonia. This shock and awe, you see in the paper, and a lot of people interpret that to mean bombs falling in Baghdad, the opening limits of war, putting them in a state of shock, and you take over. That's not it at all. They don't understand. It's a different way of fighting, rather than closing with the enemy forces, slugging it out until one side is defeated. That's the old way of war. The new way of war is saying, what do we want? In this case, we want the regime out of the way so we can get rid of weapons of mass destruction. So first of all, you got to always keep in mind what your job is. And sometimes we in the military lose our ways, and certainly sometimes our political leadership loses its way. The way we stumbled onto it was in 1990. We were going to take down the Iraqi air defense system. And I was blessed by a Navy organization called SPEAR that was organized in secret at Dahlgren. And their job was to look at the Soviet Union and say, how do we best take down the Soviet Union with our nuclear strikes? So in other words, if you want to take down the utility system of the Soviet Union, you could bomb every mill or every plant that produced electricity, you could get all the switching, you could drop all the cables, you could do everything. But that would take a huge amount of effort. And they would sit down, and they're mostly electrical guys who build electrical grid systems, and they look at the photographs of the Soviet Union and say, okay, if you put one bomb here and one bomb there, you'll completely isolate this whole section of the country. So it was an efficiency thing, and it was getting the desired effects. So they came over and briefed me how the air defense system of Iraq worked, and they knew it inside out. And so what we did is the opening moments of the war, we dropped one bomb on the telephone building down there at Baghdad because all the cables, communication cables in Iraq ran through that one node. So suddenly now, all the air defense sectors can't talk to each other. And remember, they've been trained by the Russians, and a pilot did not fly an airplane unless he was told where to turn, when to shoot, everything. Everything was very close control. So suddenly we isolated them, and then we put bombs on the Sector Operations Center. And so their pilots would take off in the night and immediately get shot down. 3 nights later, the only time they'd fly was to go across country to Iran. They were done. So we achieved the effect we wanted. Well, not by shooting down every airplane, not getting big air battles where our airplanes got shot down, not putting a lot of lives at risk. We got the effect that we wanted by just hitting them so hard that they couldn't do anything else. We changed their behavior. We also went after the Iraqi leadership, the same idea, but we didn't know how Saddam Hussein kept power in Iraq. So we were never able to do it. We were never able to change his behavior. As a result, it was beyond our capacity to understand. We have no reference to what it's like to live in a society where you're ruled totally by fear. And we're beginning to see that now as we're going into Iraq now and we're hearing these stories about what went on in that country, how he maintained control. But we would have had to understand that then to know where to put the scalpel in order to make him change his behavior. As it turned out, we were in a better position than we thought we were. A guy named Wafiq was his intelligence guy, and he came out in 1994, and I had dinner with him in London. And he said the last night, when the night we declared the end of the hostilities, he said Saddam Hussein was in deep depression, he was crying, he was almost suicidal. And he said, I walked in and told him that the President of the United States had just announced that they're ceasing offensive operations against him, and he went before it. He said, we won. And he believed it because to him, winning was staying alive. Winning was staying in power. And so we failed to grasp Saddam Hussein, how he functioned, how he operated, and so we were never able to change his behavior. But I always think back, 2020 hindsight, if we'd known the condition he was in, maybe we could have terminated those hostilities in a different way. Maybe we could have extracted something out of him that would have precluded us having to do what we're doing today. That's 2020 hindsight. In Kosovo, the West Clark was the commander in Europe, and he sent the forces out to bomb tanks in Kosovo, attrition warfare. Well, there was no ground threat, and remember, we said we weren't going to put ground forces on the ground, so the Serbian army was able to spread its tanks out next to schools, mosques, and in villages, and put them in convoys with farmers and things like that. So we got to chasing these tanks, and we were never killing any of them, or very few. And it was very frustrating. And the only thing that kept us in that war was the fact that the Serbs were so vicious in their treatment of the ethnic Kosovars. And so night after night on television in Europe and the United States, you'd see some woman whose husband had been hacked to death and was sitting in a snowy field with 3 kids around her, crying her eyes out. And that kept us in that war for the first 55 days, because quite frankly, we were not making any military progress. On day 55, General Clark was convinced to switch to an effects-based operation with shock and awe. And what we did is we targeted all the economic things that Milosevic, his his wife, and their cronies, their gangsters, are running Serbia, what they consider important. And I'll give you an example. There was one guy who was Department of Forestry. He also happened to own lumber mills, so he could go out and break the forest anywhere he jumped to them, and we saved it. He also had the banks that made housing loans, so he was taking money in every which way. Well, in Yugoslavia, there was one factory that built some chemical that you have to have to treat wood to make it so that you can use it for lumber so that it doesn't swell when it gets wet. We took out that factory. That guy is out of business. So now he starts talking about Milosevic, about, hey, this hurts. We did that time after time after time to the things that were important to the regime, not killing tanks in Kosovo. And on day 78, Milosevic announced to the surprise world, I'm out of here, I've had it, you can have Kosovo. And he pulled his army out. And remember, that army that left Kosovo was unbeaten. It was pretty well intact. So you see, it can be done. It can be done. In Afghanistan, we use bombs, we use special operations, we use forces that have been banked on by their fingernails. We also use bribes. I mean, CIA guys walking up to tribal walls with suitcases with millions of dollars in them. Why don't you join our side? I said, yeah, I can do that. So, shock and awe isn't necessarily bombs on the opening night. It's a campaign that all works together. What are the key elements? First of all, you've got to be fast. Rapid is important. Now, what's fast? Well, fast is relative. If you're getting shot at by a SAM missile, radar-guided SAM missile, your electronic countermeasure pod has to be able to answer that signal and jam it within microseconds. So that's fast. On the other hand, in World War II, we used shock and awe on the Japanese Empire with 2 nuclear weapons or atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But they would have not had any effect if we dropped them in 1941. They had to be dropped after 4 years of arduous war and sacrifice and preparing the Japanese mindset to understand that they were losing this thing and that they better get out now. This is their really last chance. So you see, fast can be years or it can be microseconds. You gotta move. And I'll tell you what, when I saw that 3rd Division move out like they did, I said they understand. They've got a strategy that understands, because as long as our Army guys were moving and the Marines were moving on the ground, that meant we held the initiative. The minute we had to stop for those sandstorms, you remember how they came out of the woodwork and suddenly they were popping our people. Suddenly we're taking casualties because we see the initiative of the enemy. When we're moving fast, he doesn't know where we are, where we're going, and what we're going to do. And that's when we go. I think the next element I would talk about was in knowledge. We have preoccupation in our country with counting things. We're all CPAs. And so we define our enemy by how many tanks, planes, soldiers, ships, whatever they have. And we see that really does pretty good because it's will, it's culture. You have to understand your enemy as a human being, as a system, in order to know where to put the scalpel. And normally in the past, we just take a blunt hammer and beat him in the head. But now we have scalpels. And of course, in Desert Storm, I kept hitting Sodom in the butt instead of in the brain. And failed. But that requires a really exquisite way of looking at the enemy. You got to look at them as a system. And then you know what to do. The other thing you have to do is, as you change the enemy, you have to know what those changes are, because you have to change your plan. So an enemy is like an organism. It mutates as it reaches stimuli, and you have to anticipate what that is, and you have to have a new plan, new plan, new plan, new plan. And that's very difficult for an army, for example, because you have hundreds of thousands of people on the ground. You're trying to get them all headed the same way, and then the next day you say, okay, now turn right. They did that in this war. They adapted to every change that was thrust on them, and that is exactly what they need to do. The problem we had in Vietnam, we didn't know ourselves. We thought, those of us who went to Vietnam thought we were there to fight a war for victory. We didn't understand that our political goals, first of all, were not militarily achievable, and second of all, our own government wasn't signed up to achieving those goals. They just wanted to win an election. They wanted to save the Great Society, which is a good program. But they were not committed to victory like those of us who were fighting the war. And as a result, they were back in that war fairly bitter about what was going on and what we wanted to go on. We in Americans have problems. We're like fighter pilots. We're full of confidence. We're often wrong, but we're never in doubt. The third thing you have to do is you have to be able to control the environment you're in. I'll give you an example. The B-2 is a stealth airplane. It can go anywhere because it controls the electromagnetic environment it's in. And it controls the visual environment by flying at above 40,000 feet, and it controls the audio environment by having quiet engines. And so the B-2 can get away with most anything because it controls the environment. We had sandstorms last week, and the Army was fighting it out, and the Marines were fighting it out on the ground. We were able to control that environment because we have the Joint Starship plane that can see the enemy forces moving. So here we had the 3rd Division, way out in the north, both flanks exposed, a tenuous logistics supply line, the nightmare of any Army guy from World War II. Exactly the most thing they fear the most. Not to mention the fact they're outnumbered. And yet they prevailed. Why? Because we control the environment. We had an airplane that would see the enemy if he came after us. We also had GPS bombs that could hit the enemy despite the fact we couldn't see them through the sandstorms. So we controlled the weather environment. The one that is more and more important, and the one that your children and grandchildren live with, is the information environment. We have to protect our sources, and we have to deny the enemy the use it is. And that's why you see a lot of bombing in Baghdad on things like communication sites and things of this nature. And finally, one of the main environments we have to control is the media is fundamental to the warfare dynamic. And the problem we have with the media is we don't want to control it. You can't, and you shouldn't. We live in a free society. We want a free media. But we want to understand the impact the media has on our war, so our strategy has to be such that it is complemented by the presence of the media on the battlefield. Now, there's also a good side to that, and it keeps people from doing horrible things that they might have done. And this battle of the media, I can't begin to say how important that's become, and I think we all know that. And the thing is, people have become addicted to warfare television. It started with that story. And I tell the military guys who are afraid of the media, don't be afraid of the media, because the media is nothing more than a window to the American people. And if you don't trust the media, it says you really don't trust the American people. And believe me, the best thing a general can do when he screws up is stand up and say, I really screwed that up. Because every American out there says, yeah, so did I. I've done the same thing. So, and the worst thing you can do is make excuses or lie. And so that's why you see so much emphasis on truth and reporting coming out of CENTCOM, coming out of the Pentagon. And I love the way Don Rumsfeld handles the press now. The press don't love it. The last thing is it's called brilliance and execution, but really look at it this way. We have gotten to the point now, with all our computers and all of our sensors and all of our communications, where the President of the United States can literally look through the gun sight of a rifle and tell the kid there with his finger on the trigger, pull the trigger, don't pull the trigger. In the Gulf War, I sat there and I had what was flying all from Israel over to Iran, from Turkey over to Saudi Arabia. If it flew, I saw it because we had 4 AWACS aircraft on station all the time with radar, long-range radar, 5 actually. And so I, being the world's greatest fighter pilot, I had a microphone on the table in front of me and 2 enemy airplanes that take off from Balad. I wanted to grab that and I could say, Wolf Flight, Vector 020, you got 2 bogies climbing through 20,000 feet, cleared it on. That's generals want to do something. And invariably, some lieutenant, a flight leader or a captain on the AWACS will say, bear flight, you got 2 takeoff lost smoke. Boom, and it was always the right thing to do, and I was always wrong. And so I learned very quickly to sit on my hands. And I used to spend hours sitting on my hands so I wouldn't pick up that thing. That is the problem now. We are gathering data and we can bring it to any location. And so from a virtual sense, the person sitting in that location is on scene. And from a virtual sense, that person can make all the execution decisions. And quite frankly, if he's a general, obviously he's smarter than everybody else. And so he'll make a decision where there's the least likelihood of a mistake being made. Well, the trouble with that is, you get into that kind of operations, and pretty soon everybody else, between you and the rifleman, will sit back and wait for you to make decisions. And pretty soon, you lose all your rapidity and decision execution. You lose all your initiative, the thing that Americans are known for more than anything else, and you kill your organizations. And so the biggest challenge we have in the military today is how do we decentralize executions? How do we push decision authority down to the lowest level? And I talk a lot about this. I say the closer you are to combat, the more you know. Well, that's not necessarily true, but it is in terms of pulling triggers. Believe me, you know where the bullets are coming from firsthand, and you know what you want to do about it. So the fact we had a tank fire around an hotel and kill some journalists is a terrible thing. But we do not want that tank driver adding force to say, Mother may I, some operation on it. Because what we're going to do is introduce time, indecision, and lack of initiative, and we'll get those boys killed if we do that. So we have to learn to accept mistakes. We have to have leaders, and we're seeing it now, time and again, the Pentagon. He said, what about this or that? And he says, that's for the commander in senior. And you see it, Brooks down in Qatar saying, what about this? That's for the tactical commander. We need to have leaders that know how to project the vision to their people, what they want done, that know how to give them enough rules so when they make a mistake, it isn't a huge mistake, and then know how to live with people who make mistakes, because that's how we're going to go forward, and that's how we're going to do the best. And this is a critical issue, not only in the military, but also in industry and in business. This centralization versus decentralization of execution authority. Before we go to questions, I'll just say this. Can we do shock and awe leadership? And the answer to that is yes. We brought in over 150 psychologists, psychiatrists. We had some pinko commies. We had a bunch of long-haired guys call them in. I mean, these people paid for it to the man and woman. They were all highly educated. They all said yes, you can do shock and awe leadership. You can change behavior, but you have to have a lot of knowledge on what you're doing, and you have to monitor what you're doing. Well, should we do it? Should we change the way we fight wars? Let me tell you this. They just did an analysis of if we use the same kind of loss rate we suffered in World War II versus the war in Iraq today, we could expect to have 17,000 American soldiers dead. So we are making progress, and we are getting better and more humane. Let's go to questions. Then you can throw me out. I can't see, so just stand up and speak up. Yes, I'm saying that. He liable to be, but I don't think you're going to find the body. 4 2,000-pound bombs on his house. There might be some DNA in some of those bricks.
Do you know anything about the SR-71 that we needed so badly in the first war?
What happened is the SR-71 gave us the capability to take a look at wide areas of territory. And in Desert Storm, we retired the SR-71s. We had the U-2s, but they didn't have the ability to cover so much. And we had satellites, but they're kind of like looking through a soda straw. They're not really good at wide area. They call it synoptic coverage. I don't know that word. But in reality, sometimes you're dealing with fears of people, and I understand those fears perfectly. The soldiers on the ground are always worried about what's over that next hill. And I would be too if I was on the ground. On the other hand, we knew pretty much what was over there. But just nobody would believe it. And the problem we have is if you're a soldier or a Marine, you're asking a lot of that guy to say, trust me. Because when you don't carry through with your promises, he's the person that dies. So the problem we've had is getting the ground forces to understand that war is fundamentally changed, that air power is the dominant force on the battlefield. They don't want to hear it. Quite frankly, they should maneuver not want to engage the military forces until we do so at a time, place, and force ratio of Washington. And we can manage that because we know where they are, they don't know where we are. We can get to them faster because we go in airplanes. And all this sounds like a bunch of air power hooey. But you're seeing it, you saw it in Desert Storm, you saw it in Kosovo, you saw it in Afghanistan, and you're seeing it today in Kosovo, and certainly Iraq. And we've got to learn to fight like that. We've got to learn to fight as a team. And it's going to require things like, don't worry about what's over the next mountain. And so, yeah, SR-71 provided a lot of useful information, but in the case of Desert Storm, it just told us there was nowhere there.
General, these couple quick questions about North Korea. First of all, in your mind, your experiences, are they a threat? And if so, are these phenomenally successful tactics that you've been explaining equally applicable to warfare in that country?
Every situation is different. Now, first of all, you got to understand what North Korea is about. North Korea is about blackmail. You notice the North Koreans are always saying, this is a problem between us and the United States. Why do they say that? It's because the United States got money. They don't want to say this is a problem between us and China, which it really is. Because the Chinese, they give us one ounce of wheat, and that's about it. So, Korea is not the same as Iraq, it's not the same as Afghanistan. It's not the same as Iran. Use of military force against Korea would probably be most inappropriate because, if nothing else, they will unleash an artillery barrage on Seoul that will kill hundreds of thousands of people. So we're kind of in a conventional weapons detente between the United States and North Korea. We also have a change in South Korea. South Korea had a bunch of people that grew up in the Korean War, and they love America because what we sacrifices we made in their behalf. Those people are old. We all know. That's where I'm coming from. As a result, the young people were born 20 years after the Korean War, and they're running the country now. They do not have the same perspective as we do. They tend to see the American forces as an occupying force, not as a liberating force or a protective force. They tend to see that their goal is to reunite with their brothers in the North and become a united country. So you will see us literally pulling our military out of Korea because it's the right thing. South Korea is much stronger than they were. They can protect themselves. And also, North Korea is not in any position to attack anybody. The minute they attack anybody, they're so fragile. Now, they'll inflict a lot of damage if they do it, because they're tough, but they're fragile. So what we have to do is we have to make the North Korean nuclear weapon program a multinational problem. We cannot allow them to maneuver us in a position where it's us buying them off with food and light water plants and fuel, like they did the last time. We got to get China involved because it's really China's problems first and foremost. First of all, unified Korean nuclear weapons could be China's worst nightmare. And if nothing else, the North Koreans are scaring the hell out of the Japanese. And that's China's real problem, is that Japan decides they need nuclear weapons. But also the North Korean nuclear weapons. That's a problem for all of us. So those are the kinds of things we got to be careful.
What do you think of the United Nations?
United Nations. I'm not a politician. It's like somebody asked me about the French. And I said, well, I giggle at all the jokes. But in reality, we're a great people in this country, and we should take the high road on this. If somebody doesn't agree with us, that's okay. The problem with the United Nations, we've always understood this, that it gets bound up in views that are not necessarily held for logical reasons, but for nationalistic reasons or local reasons. So I think we've tried to make the United Nations work, and now we're going to let us in charge. That is the price we pay for living in this wonderful country. It's our time in history, and we're going to take leadership now. Hopefully it won't be war. Hopefully it'll be things like Disney World and CNN we shouldn't expect the United Nations to solve problems that is beyond its reach. But I do think we need to stay high in our relationships with all our people, because we in France are going to have a great deal of shared values. The people of France deeply appreciate what we did. And so when this pipsqueak comes over and says, how many boys you want to die in Iraq? And you say, well, how many are buried in France? So I think Colwell was the best. He was in Europe. He's in England. And a anti-war guy said, I suppose you people want to take over Iraq. And he says, the only foreign land the Americans have ever occupied is the ones they're buried in.
Yeah, completely.
And he said a hush fell over the room.
Is it true that we pay the French rent on the cemeteries where our soldiers are?
I have no idea.
Yes, it is.
We've all been very impressed with the character and training of our military forces in the war, and just simply awed by the technology. In your assessment, how far ahead are we of any potential adversary in the 21st century?
Well, you're only as good as your last win. There's somebody out there thinking right now, you got to hand it to Bin Laden. I mean, he's a horrible human being to daft you think, but he certainly he changed the attitudes in this country. He changed the attitudes in the world, and he's sparked a fight now that we're going to have to get into. You know, Bin Laden started this fight. What we didn't understand, we thought he was trying to kill us. He didn't care about us. His battle is within Islam. He's trying to steal a whole religion. And he uses us as the symbols of why he's powerful and good and get things done. And we carry baggage, our overwhelming support for Israel. So easily understood it in this country, and I support it. But nonetheless, if you're watching Al Jazeera, you see Palestinians with their houses being bulldozed out and women killed by bulldozers and things like that. So it's a struggle that's going on in Islam, and we're the ones that caught up with it. So he started a firestorm, and we're going to finish it.
All this war was apparently started from September 11th. And we went through Afghanistan, now we're in Iran, and so forth. What is your opinion is going to go on with terrorism? How is it going to keep the block, run down, or whatever now?
Well, the question to do is what's the future of terrorism? I guess the answer is we're always going to have it. What we have to do is like weapons of mass destruction. We have to get rid of arbitrary weapons. We have to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. And terrorism is going to be around. We're stuck with it. But the world's always been a dangerous place. Nick Grimberg said he took his hands like this. He says, he says there's always been crazies in the world. He said, we didn't care. He says, now the world is so small, with jet planes, with television, with satellite telephones, and things like that. And he said, now they have access to weapons of mass destruction. And he says, that's what makes the world different now. So we're stuck with a long, hard fight. Hopefully, this sends a message. You know, we may not come out of Iraq loved, but we're going to come out of Iraq respected. And when we talk to Iran about the nuclear weapons program, we're going to listen more attentively. When we talk to Syria about the nuclear missile programs, they're going to listen more attentively. We've got to make it so it is not an advantage for a country to have weapons of mass destruction. We've got to make it so a country has no advantage in harboring terrorists. We pursue the terrorists just as hard as we do. And that's happening around the world, and we're seeing it. And a lot of, they said there was 11 incidences that they were able to stop because the police forces of the world now are motivated and working together. So we're in for it. It's a battle. We've always had a battle. I had a grandfather that once was on a stage trip to Los Angeles, and a drunk cowboy aboard the stage shot a pistol out and killed an Indian. Stagecoach driver stopped the stagecoach. The Indians took the guy out and killed him and scalped him. My grandfather was 11 years old at the time. He said, scared the hell out of him.
How do we
And I don't think this will be a political question, but how do we avoid fear so that we don't become prisoners of Homeland Security over the long haul?
Well, I agree with that. In fact, my joke is I'd love to go up to the airline counter and they'd say, you have a weapon. If you don't, one will be issued to you for this flight. And then the box cutter looking at 165 cock hammers. It's obviously a balance. I think we've gone too far because our politicians don't want to get caught short appearing to be not concerned about our safety. But I'm getting a little tired. I go through airports 4 or 5 times a week, and I'm getting tired of being searched by a guy that speaks English. I got searched, and then the guy got done. He says, I lived down the street for you. I was to say, if we'd taken the actions we've taken now, when the first wagon train got wiped out by the Sioux Indians, the border of the United States would be the Mississippi River. There's one back here.
General, how do you feel about the notion of General Schwarzkopf presenting in his book that maybe 5-7 more days would have taken care of Saddam 10 years ago?
Well, I had to write a book too, and you're, sometimes you get a little help from editors, and there's no doubt about it. I was the president the night we decided we weren't going to fight anymore, and I've been answering questions to him. So I knew that the night we quit, we were all in agreement. Now, since then, you're a little smarter.
How vulnerable are we to a communication satellite destruction? Not necessarily by Iraq, but our more sophisticated countries.
Obviously, I was a space, and we looked at that hard. There's things you can do, and some of them, we have various satellites. Commercial satellites are very vulnerable. But it's interesting, like in the Gulf War, we and Iraq are using the same satellite. We have varying degrees of hardness on our satellites. The most expensive satellite we have was built for the Cold War, so we can endure things like nuclear explosions. But it didn't have, it says, go to war. So, we're vulnerable. Our space is extremely vulnerable. The way we took out the Iraqi satellite systems was bomb the antenna farms. The way we took out their intelligence satellites is ask the Russians not to give pictures, and they did. So that's how you do those things. Okay.
How do you look at closing our borders with protecting our borders? Do you have opinions on that?
Closing our borders.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, again, this goes back to that question of what's the balance of what is too much protection, too much. I think Americans are tougher than a lot of people in the world. I think we're more independent. And my view of Americans is people who say, well, it's dangerous, and you may get, but it ain't going to be easy. And so I think, obviously, you have to have some measure of, but you can put the whole national treasury and close the border, and you can't stop drugs coming across. So I think there's a balance. I think we've probably gone too far. Secretary Rumsfeld was upset because the Border Patrol came and they wanted soldiers in each of the stations along the Canadian border. But they weren't going to have guns and bullets, they were their guns. And they had no authority, and the Department of Defense was supposed to pay for them to be there. And he said, well, if you're not going to let us shoot anybody, So I think we have a problem. Quite frankly, our security starts at home. We're looking out for each other, helping one another, the things that Americans have always done. And we live in a country that can't be policed. We don't have enough police. And that's because we're law-abiding. It's a tenet of our existence, and that comes from our basic foundation. our founding fathers. That's important to us. And it's the only way you can really have a good free society. The only way you can have a productive society is have a free.
So let's get back to the battlefield for a second.
Okay?
Go out 20 years and take the unmanned aerial vehicle craze and tell us what you see in 20 years.
Well, what happened is they have a saying now, unmanned aerial vehicles is the solution. What's the question? If you want to ride a winning horse, just build yourself an unmanned vehicle. They have done amazing things. The Predator, in Afghanistan, they shot down a helicopter. And so this young Air Force guy was laying on the back door. The first three Army guys out the door were immediately shot to death. Their bodies were laying right there in front of me. Everybody else is moaning, hurt, groaning. He's okay. And he's got a radio. And he's talking to this unmanned vehicle directly over his head, flying around, this Predator. The guy flying the Predator is located in the United States. All night long, when the Al-Qaeda guys would come up to kill him, the Predator guy would say, now just tell me where they are. I mean, one thing says, they're under the bonsai tree. There's a little studded pine tree growing on this mountain. And it looked like these Japanese bonsai trees. So they're on the bonsai tree. So now the Predator guy had to run his soda straw all around until he found this little pine tree, and then he called in F-14, dropped 2,000-pound bombs on it, and got the guys. But the guy on the back of the helicopter had these night vision goggles, so occasionally the guy in the Predator, who's located in the United States, would dazzle the ground with his laser illuminator, and he could see it with his night vision goggles. And all night long, he kept this kid from losing it. And that's the kind of things going. We will go to vehicles that carry bombs to hit fixed targets. I do not see us having these combat vehicles that fly air-to-air combat. To me, it's a waste of time. We've got that they're called AMRAAMs, Phoenix. We know how to do that. We will have them do a lot of the stuff that we normally do now, reconnaissance. Reconnaissance will all go to unmanned vehicles. And they'll replace low Earth satellites because they provide the best of the SR-71 and the best of the satellite.
One more question.
I just wondered, in view of the fact that, at least in my opinion, the United Nations involvement in 91 kept us from really finalizing what we should have done, are we not better off now not having the United Nations involvement? I realize there are some trade-offs, but would they be preventing us from doing, if they had been involved, what we should be doing?
Well, of course, there's so many opinions about what we should be doing, like in the case of Iraq. There's people that are absolutely against us being absolutely forced being there, and they're all Americans. So people have different opinions. I think that we're in the world, and we got to live in the world. And any way that we can reach out and communicate with other people, there's going to be positive benefits over the long term. The United Nations did not keep us from going into Iraq. France in the UN tried to keep us from going into Iraq for their own reasons, economic, political, and attitude. But so we are a country that, quite frankly, gives the United Nations its structure, form, and legitimacy to be in with NATO and not necessarily be in NATO. And suddenly the war in Afghanistan came along, and suddenly our airplanes are flying out of countries I can't even pronounce the name of. And the reason is because those guys, when the Soviet Union broke up, they became Partnership for Peace with NATO, and so they knew our guys, and we could talk to each other, and we built these kind of relationships. So I think the answer on the UN is we may be a little bit angry about what happened to us there. We may be a little bit reluctant the role they play in Iraq after this war is over and we start this nation building. But at the end of the day, we're all in the same world. We've got to learn to talk to one another. We've got to learn to live with one another. And the United Nations provides some means. And there's some things it does very well. Humanitarian, it also gives form for people to do peacekeeping and things like that. So there's a lot of benefits to the United Nations. But quite frankly, they came close to striking out on this Iraq. And we were blessed with leadership stepped in the gap. I think all of us are extremely proud of our military just amazed, I think we all are, at the quality of those young men and women. Just,